Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Eelwood and today, as per one of our very good viewers' request, we are taking a look at Fate, an old school classic released all the way back in 2005, and to answer the ultimate question, is it worth your time? But also bear in mind guys, I am playing the 2013 Steam port of the game, so there may be some slight differences from the original. So, Fate is a single-player, action-adventure, dungeon crawler RPG set in a fantasy medieval world. You'll be delving further and further down randomly generated dungeons, taking on hordes of enemy monsters left, right and centre, all in hopes of reaching the last boss close to the very bottom. So, aesthetically, the game's visuals are very good, for back in the day anyway. It definitely has that early 3D rendered game look to it from the good old WoW Classic / PS2 days of gaming, giving everything that bright, charming, simplistic look to it with a consistent glow that you can't help but love. Colours used are very bright in general, which in some areas do give off too much of a light-hearted, childish feel, but fortunately while dungeon delving, which is obviously most of the time, this does get balanced out pretty well due to the crazy amount of lighting effects and looming darkness. Speaking of Fate's best visual assets, the amount of shadow effects, environmental lighting, enemy and player auras, water and lava glows, magic effects, explosions and more are all insane. Each is, as mentioned, your classic old school 3D game lighting. Very crude, unrealistically bright and way too much opacity. Exactly how we like it. Most areas of the dungeon have so many effects, when you encounter large groups of enemies, it's almost impossible not to get at least a small drop in FPS on max settings. Even on a 14-year-old game, which is surprising. Textures and detail are also pretty good. Not a lot of ground clutter, which I prefer, and things like grassy floors, stone tiles and cave walls all look pretty realistic and are full of subtle character for back then. The UI is a bit busy for my liking. Your HP, mana and consumable bar at the bottom are fine, but the menu buttons above them cause the UI to take up a nice chunk of the bottom screen with no option to hide it. All the other bits on the screen are okay, and the minimap is actually pretty good. It even allows you to adjust your zoom, but unfortunately doesn't display minimap icons other than NPCs, so no additional dungeon delving support from that perspective. Level layouts are in general pretty awful in my opinion. Pretty much every floor you delve to has way too many narrow corridors that branch off on their own and a lot of the time lead to dead ends constantly, so expect a lot of backtracking as a result. Character and enemy designs, however, I have to say are pretty impressive. Enemies like giant spiders, vampires, yetis and more all look amazing and have very powerful, dramatic animations to suit the damage they deal very well. I love how a lot of the larger enemies are literally fucking massive, and I mean so big it doesn't look like they can actually fit in a lot of the corridors that you need to navigate through, which did make me laugh. Your characters' designs, however, are okay, but then again, animations for a standard human are not exactly game changing, so understandable. Attacking is pretty generic and casting spells are nothing special. The game definitely makes you feel weak compared to everything else in the game due to the way your character has been designed. If that was the dev's intention, very good job. Overall, a pretty well designed game visually. The OSTs in Fate are pretty decent, a lot of orchestrated sounds used combined with plenty of custom FX sounds to give each track that definite old school feel. Each track has more of a focus on the background effects, a lot of drums used, and do take a while for the main melody to kick in. And when I researched it, it turns out there's literally only 6 OSTs in the entire game, which is a bit of a shame. Each dungeon track though is so different from each other, it's very hard to describe exactly what they're like as a whole. Almost as if each track in the game was made by a completely different person, which is very unusual. But the 3 traits they do share are light, eerie, ominous and drawn out sounds, which do complement the dungeon visuals and help remove the light-hearted feel of the game very well. The town soundtracks, however, are your more classic RPG tracks, as you'd expect. But again, due to the very few amount of OSTs, I can't really describe many consistencies. Everything else sound related is fine though. The sounds of spells, attacks, enemies and your character are all fine. I especially like the very loud, distinct environmental sounds like water burbles and fires crackling. In Fate, you also have a narrator very similar to World of Warcraft, in that he narrates certain things at certain times, like advising you of low HP, your lack of inventory space, or your pet fleeing constantly, which can get very annoying at times due to its consistency. Now for the gameplay. So firstly, Fate does have a few difficulty options to choose from before you play. You can choose between Page, Adventurer, Hero or Legend mode. I personally went straight into Hero mode because I think I'm awesome. A big mistake, I can assure you. I tried out a few of the other difficulties and found out the higher you go, the more unfair the game will become. Unless you're a die-hard player and know the ins and outs of the game like the back of your hand, and must be upgrading your gear constantly between floors. Also keep in mind, once your difficulty has been selected, you won't be able to change it again for that character. Once your difficulty has been chosen, you have a few options to customize your character, such as gender, hair and face type. You even get to choose between a cat or a dog as your permanent companion, which I have to admit is a fucking awesome idea. Once your character has been created, you're given a bit of dialogue to explain the game's very basic storyline. You're basically an adventurer that has travelled to a certain forest town after hearing tales of a great gate leading to a dungeon of infinite adventure. You hope to test your strength in this dungeon while finding fortune and glory on the way. That's pretty much the game's story in a nutshell. Just as a small continuation of the game's lore, when you do arrive in town, you'll notice a wizard that, when spoken to, will randomly generate your last boss to kill for the game to be considered complete. I personally was assigned an Ogre champion on floor 47 of the dungeon, which will be different for everyone. So once you've seen the intro dialogue, you can then take control of your character and play. You are thrown quite literally straight into the game as per the old school way, but you do get tip pop-ups to give you a helping hand when first starting off. If you haven't already noticed, Fate is extremely similar to Diablo games, thus having very identical gameplay mechanics. But for those who aren't familiar, your character's movement is controlled purely with your mouse. You would typically hold the left mouse button down and your character will follow it indefinitely until released. This also applies when attacking or using abilities, which in this case you would use your cursor to aim and your chosen ability will be used either in its direction or at the location of your cursor. Abilities are assigned to your F keys on your keyboard manually. You can swap between each ability pressing the corresponding key. Once selected, you press the right mouse button to use the selected ability where your cursor is currently located. Oh, and by the way, you can press A and D on your keyboard to shift your camera slightly either to the left or to the right. That's literally all the controls in the entire game. The game also includes a few additional mechanics to help keep the gameplay somewhat lively and fresh. These include finding interactable shines that do certain things when clicked, picking up quests off NPCs that give randomly generated enemies to kill in exchange for items and gold, plenty of vendors that sell pretty much everything you will ever need. When you die, you're brought to a selection screen where you choose what happens in exchange for the price of a respawn, which is presumably where the whole Fate concept originated from. You have the ability to change your pet's form and stats for a set time when feeding it various fish, which is cool as fuck. The ability to actually fish for the fish using a fishing rod in certain pools of water or lava, and much more. Other details to mention, the loot system is comprised of magical, rare and artifact rarity items, which have to be identified and have increased bonuses as your items increase in rarity. The inventory management system is exactly like Diablo, where you have a certain amount of slots available with large items taking up more spaces in your bag. Your main source of healing is done via purchasing potions, placing them on your toolbar at the bottom and using them when needed. And when you level up, you're granted 5 stat points and 2 ability points to spend, which can be distributed over the various passives and attributes available as you see fit. The core objective of the game is pretty obvious. Enter a floor, walk around, kill enemies, take on bosses, collect gear, then enter the next floor, all while leveling and doing stuff back at the town in between. Enemies in Fate are very easily underestimated. They do look pretty lighthearted in general, but hit like a fucking truck on the higher difficulties and when grouped up together. A lot of the time you will get swarmed very easily and won't be able to run away due to your path being blocked constantly. Enemies also have boss versions of themselves which have increased stats, resistances and threat to the player, often noticed by a red glow to indicate danger. When you spot these stronger enemies, take care taking on these bad boys. Overall, a very simple gameplay concept that can be extremely unforgiving on the harder difficulties. So for the ultimate question, is it worth your time? Its lovable old school visuals, to the point concept and simple gameplay do make for a charming gaming experience that unfortunately on the higher difficulties did become tedious and boring very quickly. I'm going to give this game a 3.5 star or 72 out of 100. As mentioned, I like the quirky death screen with a selection on how your character respawns. I love the whole pet concept and the fact your companion will be by your side for your entire playthrough, but probably both the game's biggest asset and flaw in my opinion is that it's way too similar to the Diablo game series. Literally everything in the game apart from the two things I just mentioned can be found in some shape or form, and usually more refined in either Diablo 1 or Diablo 2, which bear in mind were both released years before Fate was even announced. Fate does however have character progression which is completely customizable as opposed to Diablo's class specific system, which can give your character more of a hybrid feel, but sadly needs to be refined to even stand a chance at the higher difficulties. The ability system in Fate is very boring if you want to play as a melee character. That's because abilities in this game are all basically spells with no combat specific variants, which is a huge shame. I also don't like how every single ability in the game has to be learned via spell scrolls, which does affect the immersion quite a lot. Pretty much all floors have way too many corridors you'd be backtracking through constantly, and after floor 20 as a melee character I had to speedrun the remaining 27 floors because it was just too much of the same thing over and over, with auto attack being my only damage dealing ability. I couldn't even use an AoE. Personally, Fate just makes it into my recommended on the general condition that you play as a caster character with increased cast speed to at least have an enjoyable gaming experience. But don't touch any of the higher difficulties because the game will become a chore to complete. If you've got £5 spare and fancy a Diablo-like game while loving spellcasters, Fate is the game for you. But if you had £9 as opposed to £5, I'd have to recommend the timeless Diablo 2 every time. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more games I'll be reviewing each week, and thanks again Tablet Brothers for the game request. You did mention that Fate is a very close game to your heart, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I do feel like a bit of an arsehole making a mediocre review for something that means so much to you. I do hope that the points mentioned somewhat line up to your opinions of the game as well, and that my level of honesty always keeps you entertained. But as always, all the best guys, take care.